Thank you for joining us today for part 6 of our Genealogy Beginners series, Building and Researching Your Family Tree. Today, we will be discussing cemeteries. I'm Bill Buckner of the Genealogy Center, and today, Ron Dirth of the Central Texas Genealogical Society will be joining us. CTGS is a co-sponsor of this event. What's the genealogical value of cemeteries? Types of information that are found in cemeteries includes vital records, relationships, nicknames, occupations, photographs. These are the types of things that we hope to find. It's the good stuff. Can a headstone solve a family mystery? Yes. Have you ever found a Masonic symbol attached to an ancestor's tombstone? Or perhaps the proximity of another grave would give you information on a first or second marriage. This stone of Sarah Jane Ragsdale includes not only her parents and her husband, but all her kids. And if you note that in 1870, if you were missing that census, this record, the cemetery record, would give you lots of clues to find out who the children were at that time. Other types of information include vital records. Obviously, that's the type of information we would first look for: birth, death, and in this case, marriage information. You also will find relationship information. One of the things that we seek in genealogy is relationship information. And so in this case, Izora Hudson, we know that her maiden name was Wallace, and her married name was Hudson. Always look for parents, wives of, brother, sister, all kinds of good information about relationships. Now note too, cemetery tombstone information is what we consider secondary information. There is no date on the tombstone itself of when or who put the tombstone in place. And so we always have to be cautious and evaluate what we find and support it with other records. Other types of information you might find are nicknames. And so here we find Gary Allen Merrick, also known as Papa Hank, and Cynthia Young, also known as Cindy, with a unique spelling of Cindy. So look for nickname information and then always record it in your family surname log, given name log, so you'll have that information to search other records. Another type of information that gives you a really good clue, it's helpful, is occupation information. What do you think the occupation of this Mr. Lemuel Zach Bill, that's a given name or a nickname, carpenter is? Rancher? Probably so. So always look for hobbies, occupation, interest, things and clues on tombstones. And photographs. Wouldn't it be awesome to find a photograph of your ancestor where no known photographs exist from the late 1800s through the present? These types of photos are called ceramic memorials or gravestone portraits, or photo porcelain plaques. You can still find these today on the internet for sale, how to include your own ancestor's picture on a tombstone. And so from the late 1800s to the present, you may find these, that surprise on a tombstone. So after types of information, where can we find burial, tombstone information? What kind of records would we be looking at? Of course, cemetery records. We'll look at those, the sextant records, information from the churches, death certificates offer us clues, funeral home records, obituaries, necrology, we'll discuss that, military headstone applications. Proximity records are clues of other graves next to your ancestor's grave. Occupation or organizational sections of cemeteries that give you a clue as to what their occupation or their organization was. And then cemetery inventories, the most popular type of record that we find in print and online. Now, today we are documenting in the next section where we found the records that we are presenting, whether they are in print from the field, actually a photograph or go into the field, and digitally. This information, there's an icon in the right bottom section of each slide, and it gives you a clue as to where that information came from. We borrowed this technique from Executive Director of the Board for Certification, Rebecca Whitman Colford. We thought it was very valuable to show, and we'll just have to wait to the end to see what the results are. Now, there's some important vocabulary that I wanted to discuss. People use these terms interchangeably: cemetery records and cemetery inventory. So some people consider the inventory as the cemetery record. A cemetery record itself is maintained, created, and maintained by the cemetery association or who owns the cemetery. Information about burial plots, who bought the plot, that sort of information, when the person may have been buried. A cemetery inventory is basically a survey of stones above ground that is done at a certain time. And one of the tips we want to mention there is that you always want to look for any inventory of a cemetery, early ones, recent ones. Sometimes your ancestor's tombstone listed in an early inventory may not exist today due to vandalism, weather, just all kinds of things that can happen to tombstones. Now, one place to find cemetery records is from a sexton, a person in charge of the cemetery maintenance. They usually have information, alphabetical list by plot list and by section list. You want to look and see if there's actually a active cemetery association, either it's a city or a county or private. You want to look for that information. You might find a kiosk at a cemetery, as in the photo here shows, listing where people are buried and what section. You find this a lot in military graveyards, military National Archive and that sort of thing, where you can find where your ancestor is buried. And then two, you want to look at if there's a church or another type of association, the records that you want to inquire from the church or that association. Now, death certificates give us a great clue as to where a person is buried. In this case, this person is in Friendship Cemetery there at the bottom in Milam County. I will offer a tip that people can change their minds. So once that death certificate is posted or certified, people can find out that maybe they had a free plot somewhere, or maybe and they changed the cemetery to another place. So it's not always 100%, but it does give us a clue. Funeral home records. This one from Nicholas Funeral Home in Rosebud in Falls County. I want to point out that there in the Grace M. Lovelace that she was cremated. So this is a time, today's death certificates include disposition of a body, whether it was cremated, donated, that sort of thing. But in the past, that wasn't a part of the actual death certificate. And so in this case, we find through the funeral home record that this individual had been cremated. Sometimes that offers us the clue as to what happened and why there's no grave, perhaps in a cemetery. Now, obituaries are what we look for to give us clues as to not only what funeral home offered the services, what cemetery the person may have been buried in, when the service was, and what church this cemetery funeral service was at. These all give us clues and are just invaluable in our research for cemetery records. Necrology, this is kind of a new term for a lot of folks. It's typically associated with organizations. So the Masons would have a necrology section in their annual report, or a Lions Club might have a necrology service for members that had passed in the past year. So necrology is, sometimes you find it in the paper, but it's typically associated with organizations. And so look for that term as well in your research. Now, if you ever find a military marker on an ancestor's grave, you want to think in terms of there might have been an application for that marker, and which might lead you to more information. And so veterans headstone applications from 1925 to 1963 are available from various sources. And they can be actually applied for many years after the date of death. Sometimes the contact or the person filling out that application is a relative. These headstones do not have birth date information, and in this case, this file is found on fold 3. Family burials. It's so important to look at who is next to your ancestor. And so there are like billion graves and some other, other sources that actually provide maps or GIS information. Family Search is starting to provide that, but always take a look at visit the cemetery and ask yourself who is next to or in a family plot, the curbing of a family plot with your ancestor. These are typically relatives. You also want to look at doing a surname search within the cemetery itself that you find your ancestor in. And believe it or not, there are actually plots for, say, firemen in a cemetery here. And then Oakwood Cemetery has a section for firemen. There might be a Masonic cemetery or International Oddfellows section or cemetery. So look for the organizational or occupational plots of your ancestors. And then we come down to cemetery inventories. This is Chapel Hill Cemetery, produced by the McLennan County Cemetery Interest Group. And it has a map with the ancestor's name and birth and death dates. There's actually any information found on the stone as part of this inventory. So always look for all variations on the cemetery. So where did our records end up? Well, we were tied for all of them for nine different slides. We had 3 from print sources, 3 from actual in the field photographs or going to the field, and 3 digital. So just remember that not all information, not one single source is where you would find your information, but there are multiple sources to look for cemetery information.
Hello, I'm Ron Dirth from the Central Texas Genealogical Society, and I'm going to discuss a little bit with you about online cemetery resources, things that you can do from the comfort of your own home or here at the library itself using their resources. A couple things we're going to talk about are original records that come from a single source, and also crowdsourced records that come from volunteers. First one we'll talk about is interment.net. This website has been around for quite a while, and this is a single source website that you can search by location. So we're going to do an area search for McLennan County. The search that we brought up will make a list of all the cemeteries that are available on interment.net in McLennan County that we've just searched. And from that, we're going to focus on Klostner Cemetery on the lower left portion of your screen. And that lists 65 total records for this cemetery. It may or may not be totally complete. So take that with a grain of salt. And from here, you can browse and focus on every one of the burials that are in that cemetery. The next one is billiongraves.com. This is a free website for headstone searchers, whereas volunteers take photos and upload them with a GPS tag on them. Photos and GPS locations of headstones are accessible to genealogists. Very valuable item. An example of what you can find on billiongraves.com is this for a Sarah C. Thomas, and birth and death dates and a location of the cemetery will be found there. And in addition to that, you'll also be able to see what graves are located nearby. which we've already discussed is an important part of what your cemetery research should include. The third online source we'll talk about is one called findagrave.com. Again, this is a free online database that is crowdsourced. Volunteers populate all the information on this website. By creating a free account, you can add, edit, and save information and photos on this website also. Let's do a quick search. I'm going to try to find out where my grandmother is buried. So I've placed her name in the top bar, and not knowing the exact cemetery that she may be in, I've just done a search for the entire state of Ohio. I know she's there. So starting with the broad search, we'll get a suggested location from the drop-down menu, and you click on the one that you want and it'll fill in that blank for you. And this is a result that we came up with. Looking at the search results, we find that there are 3 listings. From these 3 listings, you have to focus on what exactly are you looking for, who exactly are you looking for, which one of these meets your expectations. In this case, I see her right there. Her name is Eva Mae Sanford Dirth in Green Lawn Memorial Park in Ohio. So from that, we'll click on that. And this brings up a picture of my grandmother. Some of the things you may find on this website, findagrave.com, include the full name, including a maiden name, a birth date, a birth location, a date of death, a place of death, the name of the cemetery, the location of the cemetery, even the plot information may be included, and the GPS location of the grave, which is shown in blue where it says show map. Clicking on that will take you to the map of the cemetery and show you the exact location where her gravesite is. Very good information to know. Some of the things you also may find on Find a Grave. In this case, there is a full biographical sketch that was placed on here, listing things that happened in her lifetime. And there's often a transcription of obituaries on here also. Included on the memorial page, you may also find a section that has photographs that include a portrait of them. You may find an obituary shown here, and of course, their headstone. A very useful thing to find here also are links to other family members. Each one of these is a link to the memorial for the parents, siblings, the spouse, and the children's. You may not conclude that these are all correct though. So you have to do your own research to make sure that this is complete. Not all of them are complete as this one is. So evaluate the information and look for verification. Find a Grave is useful to find a cemetery close to where you are, or in another part of the country for that matter. In this case, we're going to find a cemetery by doing a broad search in McLennan County. And what this has come up with is a list of the cemeteries included in McLennan County. This is very useful if you don't know the name of the cemetery, but you know an approximate location of where it may be. And these are all links also. When you click on these, it'll take you to the information for that cemetery. It could also be used as a map view. This is the map view that's presented for a portion of McLennan County. And this is just basically the area around downtown Waco, Texas. And keep in mind also that not all cemeteries may be shown because not all cemeteries have been added to Find a Grave yet, but we're working on it. The volunteers are. Some of the things you may see on the headstones found on Find a Grave are symbols that are important. There's a resource out there called Stories in Stone, a field guide to cemetery symbolism and iconography by Keister. And there's another book that's listed in your handout for you to use as an example of how to interpret what you find on the headstones. Religious icons are often found on headstones, particularly in military cemeteries. The examples that you see here are taken from a columbarium in a military cemetery, which are cremated remains on a wall. That's why they all look so uniform to each other. But from here, at the top of each one of these, you'll see a symbol. You'll see a landing eagle, a Unitarian symbol, an infinity symbol, a symbol signifying the LDS Church, Judaism, and lastly, Catholicism. A link there will take you to the Veterans Administration, where they have a complete listing of all of the icons that they can put on your headstone, and there's about 80 of them right now. They don't all have explanations as to what they are, but at least show you which ones are available and which ones you may find on these memorials. Often you'll see animals and flowers on headstones. Normally these signify somebody who passed away way too soon, such as a child or a youngster. And you may find rosebuds, daisies, or cherub angels also signifying a life lost too soon. Another thing you may find are Masonic symbols and other organizational symbols here. Here we see the headstone for Ferris and Opal Hardin at the top, and at the bottom, focusing on Opal, you'll see that she has a symbol that signifies the Order of the Eastern Star, which is an order open to the female relatives of Masons. Another thing you may see walking through cemeteries or viewing images of cemeteries are the grave goods. And these are mostly coins that you will find primarily on veterans' headstones. Coins have personal significance. A penny left is to signify that this headstone was visited. A nickel would signify that the person visiting served with this person in boot camp. A dime signifies that they served with them in some other capacity in the military. And a quarter would signify that they were with them when they passed away. The last thing I want to discuss is a cenotaph. These are monuments that memorialize a person who was buried elsewhere, often created for people who died in war or were cremated. And in this case, this person was lost on a rescue mission in the Pacific and is not buried there because his body was not recovered. But cenotaphs are important things to know also. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill Buckner, who has some closing words on this segment.
Just a few things to remember for your research strategies in regards to cemeteries. Cemeteries, tombstones, headstones offer more than just birth and death information, as we've seen today in this brief lecture. Always try to look for a variety of sources for burial information, from the tombstone inventories themselves, burial information from the organization that manages the cemetery, obituaries, death certificates, necrology, organizational information. And remember the difference between cemetery record and cemetery inventory. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at the Genealogy Center here in Waco at 5301 Bosque Boulevard, Suite 275. We are open at this time, Monday through Friday, 10 to 6. Hours may change in the future. Our phone number is 254-750-5945. And you can reach us by email at wmclgenealogycenter@wacotx.gov. I want to thank you today for joining with us. I want to also let you know that our next segment will cover newspapers. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.